Dustin was sitting there in the living room looking at the broken lamp with his son Tyler in the timeout chair in the corner. And he was rolling over in his mind what he was going to say to his son, because he knew it was parenting time. And he was trying to think of the words he was going to say. So he called his son over and said, "Tyler, come over here and sit next to Dad on the couch. We need to talk about what's happened." And, Tyler slowly got out of the timeout chair with his head hung low and his arms crossed and that pouty face that only a 6-year-old can properly muster and execute, and made his way over to the couch and sat by his dad. And Dustin said to his son, "Tyler, do you know why you're in trouble? Why you're in timeout?" He said, "Yes, because I was playing with my football in the house." He's like, "Yep, you were doing that, and I told you not to do that, and you know what's happened? The lamp's been broken. And so that's why you're in trouble. That's why you're in the timeout chair, and there's going to be some other repercussions later on." And Tyler looked at his dad and said, "Yeah, but that's really not fair, Dad. I don't think it's fair that I'm being punished for this at all." And Dustin, trying to kind of keep his cool, said, "Okay, well, Tyler, explain to me then, why do you think it's not fair that you're being punished for breaking the lamp?" And he said, "Well, I don't think it's fair, Dad, because you've been saying for years how ugly that lamp is and how you wish someday it would break so you could throw it away. So in a sense, I did you a big favor. So, who here is guilty of breaking the lamp, right? Tyler did it by an accident, by breaking the rule and playing with his football in the house. Dustin wanted that lamp to break in his mind for years and years and years. So, both, in a sense, are kind of guilty. Or are they not? Are you only guilty of doing something wrong if you do it in deed? Or do our thoughts count as well? And this is kind of a subject that's tackled in our pretty difficult reading that we have today from the Gospel of Matthew, which comes from the 5th chapter, verses 21 through 37. And this reading from Gospel of Matthew is comes from a 2-chapter section that we started reading from last week. And what we call this section of the Gospel of Matthew is the Sermon on the Mount. So Jesus has gathered around his disciples and followers, and he's really doing some teaching on a variety of subjects, as we'll continue to read from this part of Matthew for at least the next week or two. And today, what Jesus is teaching on specifically is his interpretation of a couple of texts from what we would call the Old Testament, or what the Jewish people would call the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, which is also called the Law for short. And so first off, we see that Jesus begins with 2 of the 10 commandments that we all know fairly well. And he approaches the commandment of "Thou shalt not murder." And what does he say? He says, you think that this commandment means that you can do pretty much everything except murder somebody. But according to my interpretation, if you have a murderous thought in your head, it's the same thing as actually murdering somebody. In our modern day situation, when someone honks that horn at you in traffic for the 3rd time, and you think about getting out of your car and physically hurting them, it's the same thing as getting out of your car and physically hurting them, is what Jesus is saying. Which is a pretty strong interpretation. But Jesus doesn't stop there. He goes on to the commandment of adultery. It says again, you've heard it said, as long as you don't do this physical act of adultery, you're in the clear. But from my point of view, if you have a lustful thought, it's the same thing. What you've done in your heart is the same thing as what you've done with your hands. And again, there's really quite a strong interpretation by Jesus. Jesus then goes on to talk about divorce and oaths, or what we would say making promises, swearing. And we'll come to those for another sermon. So you just wait on that for another 3 years when we come back around to this text. But I'd like to really look at his interpretation of these two Ten Commandments, of murder and adultery. And what does it mean then if the thought is same as the deed? Well, it means a lot, doesn't it? It means what we think in our minds and feel in our hearts is the same thing we're saying and doing. And while that does sort of create a very high standard for us, I think one way we can kind of look at what Jesus is saying us today in a very positive way is that what this does do is provide sort of a radical equality among us, you know? I don't know about you, but it's real easy for me to kind of justify my actions when it comes to stuff, right? I can look at the person behind bars who's committed murder and say, well, I'm better than him, you know? Obviously, he's done something wrong. But what Jesus is saying, you really can't say that, Brian. You've had the thoughts, you didn't do the deed. You're the same as that guy in there. Which, again, puts us all on the same plane. And I think in putting us on the same plane and not allowing us to have that justification of behavior, it provides us with a sense of humility, doesn't it? Kind of makes us say, you know, I'm no different than this person. The person who physically committed adultery, the person who physically committed murder. I've done the same thing. And since I've done the same thing as them, I can be humble towards them. I can treat them with fairness and love. It actually makes us able more fully to love our neighbor, because we know that all of us, in one shape or form, have fallen short of the glory of God and broken these commandments in the way that Jesus is interpreting them. And with that too, then, it probably makes it easier to forgive, doesn't it? It makes it easier to forgive someone who's done something terrible when we've had the same thought in our mind. So again, it provides us with that sense of humility. So when we look at this teaching, I think it's important not to just look at it as this impossible standard that we can never meet, because that's forgetting everything else Jesus tells us about how he forgives us for everything and absolves us of all our wrongdoings. What Jesus is trying to do here with his disciples, and what he was trying to always do with the Pharisees, who he was constantly arguing with, is bring everyone down to the level plane and stop this endless pattern of, well, I'm better than this person because I didn't do this, and therefore I can hold myself a little bit higher. He's wanting to make us all humble about our actions and our thoughts and our deeds. That way we can actually approach each other on the same plane and love each other as we love ourselves. So that brings us back to Dustin and Tyler. Who was more guilty? Tyler, who actually broke the lamp, or Dustin, who wanted it broken in his mind in the first place? In Jesus' interpretation, both would be guilty, right? So this provides Dustin and Tyler with an interesting situation, where maybe Dustin can have a little bit of grace for his son, who's broken this lamp, and Tyler can have a little bit of grace for his dad, who's broken the lamp in his mind as well. Jesus' interpretation of these first two commandments provide a very high standard for us. But it's a good thing, because it brings us all down to an equal plane. And it lets us realize that sin is sin, no matter if it's in deed, thought, or word. And therefore, we've all sinned, we've all fallen short of the glory of God. And therefore, we're all equal. And so we can treat each other with a little bit of humility. We can treat ourselves with a little bit more grace and forgiveness, and others as well. We no longer have to do this behavior of stratifying ourselves by who did what and how this behavior is worse than the other. Because in God's eyes, it's all the same. And therefore, we are all the same. Amen.